turn it over to Dr. Melton. If you'll launch right in, we would appreciate it.
Thank you. I am pleased to be with you again tonight, and I thank you for your friendliness and your gracious hospitality. I mean, you don't know me from Adam, so you trusted me quite a bit, but I'm so glad. I have not done this before anywhere in a church setting. One of the New Testament courses that I've taught, I'm not teaching it now since I'm retired full time, but was the basic New Testament course that I taught every year. And it's a 2-semester course. So we spend the first semester dealing with the intertestamental period and the basic background of the New Testament world. And then we deal with the Gospels and the book of Acts. And then the second semester we pick up with Acts and finish the rest of the books of the New Testament. And so that's where I enjoy talking about this period of time. So that's sort of what I'm building this on. Now, we're in session 2 tonight, and what we are going to talk about, we did some background kind of things last week, but what we're going to talk about tonight is what you're really interested in, and that is what happened in the intertestamental period. And the answer is a lot of stuff. We're not going to deal with all of it tonight. We're going to deal with the major things that happened. Some of which you may have heard about or run across in your own studies, but the major things that happened. And what we are going to, I think what you will see is that the more things change, the more they remain the same. The issues of the intertestamental period are the same issues we're battling today. We call them different things, and all that sort of stuff, but the human predicament has not changed a bit. And so there is value in looking at this period of time, not just in terms of being informed about what happened and why it's important, but to recognize that the human problems that we have today are ancient. They've always been around and still are now. Now, what we're going to do next week, we may not finish everything tonight because I'm going to have a little bit of time for a question, and I've been told that I can go almost up to 6:30, but we'll leave a little bit of time for questions. And as I told you last week, you can ask me questions that I don't know, and I have no problem telling you that at all. But what we're going to do next week is we're going to deal with the literature from this period of time. What books were written during this period of time? What is surprising to a lot of people is that it was a very, very busy time in terms of books that were written, and not just regular books, but books that are quite important. So we're going to talk about the different kinds of literature. I've got a handout I'm working on, and I'll bring it with me and be able to look at it together. And then I'm going to, we obviously not going to be able to go into detail with every kind of form of literature that was written, but I want to sample some of it because it may surprise you. There were short stories that were written during that period of time. There were children's stories, just like we teach children, early age children, we teach them the Bible stories. They did the same thing. And these have survived. They're present today in a part called the Old Testament Apocrypha. Protestant Christians and Jews never canonized it, but the Roman Catholic Church did. And so it's actually a part of the Bible. We'll talk about where all that came from. And so we're going to talk about the literature next week. And then in the fourth and final sessions, we're going to ask the question of why is this period important? Why is it important for us to spend 4 Wednesday nights delving into this period of time, looking at the literature? What value does it have today? I think it has a lot, and it's important to do. I think what we're trying to do here, rather than just skip over it and assume that it's silent years that mean nothing. It prepares the way for the coming of Jesus into the world. So that's what we're going to do in our last two sessions. All right, now last week, if my memory does not fail me, we got to Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great was one of the great military leaders of all time. When I was in college, I was at ROTC, and we had military tactics classes. We still studied Alexander's battles as examples of military tactics, and I'm assuming it's still done today. Alexander was a warrior. His father was named Philip, and Philip set out to conquer the world. He didn't quite accomplish that because he was killed in battle, and Alexander becomes the leader of Philip's army. Alexander is a teenager, but he was actually fighting in his father's army when he was 12 years old. He was one of these phenomenal people. And so what Alexander does is, and we don't really see it on this map, it's not important to, he sort of gathers together what existed was sort of the remains of the Persian Empire. And what the Persian Empire was fizzling away, and so the primary political structure was a city-state. So there were city-states all up here in Macedonia, not on this map, but all through, that was sort of the form, and the Persian Empire existed sort of on paper, but it really didn't exist at all. These independent city-states were exactly what you expect. It was a form of government that in some ways was like a city, in other ways it was like a state, but they were independent. Philip had started around 350 BC. Philip had started gathering these independent city-states and ruling them, building them an empire. Now, his method was very simple. He sent his army into the city-states, and he went in to whoever led it, and he said, you've got one or two choices. You can join us, and life will be good, or we'll destroy you. You know, when you put it that way, choices become very simple. So Philip had been building, and essentially what he was doing was he was building what would become the Greek Empire. Well, he died before he finished. Alexander picked up where he left off. Alexander was a maniac, is the only word to describe it, as a soldier. He was not an armchair general. He led his troops. And so there's stories of Alexander pushing his men, riding day and night, fighting day and night, that his soldiers would drop dead of exhaustion. There are stories about Alexander's horse dropping dead under him because he pushed it so hard. He was an extremist. But he did a remarkable thing. He built the Greek Empire, and he was in his 20s. Now, when and of course he recognized, I mean, this was an empire that went through 3 or 4 time zones. So we're talking about the known world at that time. Alexander was smart enough, even though he was young. He was smart enough to know that you cannot rule that empire by military strength alone. I think he learned that from his father, Philip. You just don't have enough soldiers. When you're covering, half of the world, you cannot, there's no possible way you can do that. And so Alexander did the most brilliant thing he did. He made Greek the universal language. And what's important is why he did that. Now, Alexander's empire, which of course would be way over here as well, but people spoke their own individual dialects, their ancestral languages, and all that. Obviously, the practical value of that is that people could communicate, and so you can carry on commerce and you can do business. I mean, that's just common sense. One of the biggest barriers to human beings is the language barrier. And so Alexander made Greek the universal language. It would become the language of the state. It would be the language of business. It would be the language of government. So that if you were a business person, you would have to learn Greek just to carry on your business. If you worked in the government, you're going to have to learn Greek. People retain their ancestral languages. And so I suspect most of the people in Alexander's empire were bilingual or trilingual. But they used Greek, in the language. It was a language of commerce and business and so forth. Now, his real reason for doing that, and this is where his brilliance comes in, and this is where the trouble of the intertestamental period starts. He really wasn't terribly interested in whether or not people could communicate. That wasn't his primary purpose. That was a practical purpose. And obviously that made things better. But what he realized was that if you make Greek the universal language, what comes with the mechanics of being able to speak or write or communicate in Greek is Greek culture. Now, there are two ways to learn foreign language. Well, there are many ways today because you've got all these, I forget what the commercial is on TV. But the traditional way is that people will take Spanish or some other language in high school or they're taking it in college. And you do learn it that way. And you learn, the mechanics of the language and the grammar and all that sort of stuff. But there's another way to learn. It's harder in some ways, but it's more effective. That is, get on a helicopter, fly to Mexico City, and let them let you out. And you have to learn the language to eat. You have to learn the language to survive. We see, when you're learning it that way, you're also learning about the culture. And that's what Alexander wanted to accomplish. There is a particular culture to any language, but particular to the Greek language. And what we mean by culture is you begin speaking the language, and you began adopting the values of that culture. The language begins to change your worldview. You began to appreciate the Greek worldview. That was his intention, and he was very successful at doing so, as we're about to see. Yes, sir.
What do you think that's saying? We have people who come to our country who won't be able to learn English to communicate.
Exactly. And we want them to at least appreciate American culture. They may not have to adopt it hook, line, and sinker. And Alexander realized the same thing, that there would be people that would speak the language and they would adopt certain elements of the culture, but they would never see themselves as good Greeks. He wasn't interested in that. He just wanted people to begin to know what the values of the Greek culture are, and to begin to be sympathetic with those values. You start being sympathetic, and then eventually you say, these are pretty good things to live by. And that's exactly what he wanted to happen, and indeed it did. So, the battle during the intertestamental period, the invisible battle, was a battle between Hellenism and Judaism. Now here's what I want us to do. I want us to consider just a handful of the basic values of Greek culture, and that's what we mean by the term Hellenism. Hellenism is simply a word that describes Greek culture. What do Greeks value? What do Greeks like? What do they think are important in life? And so I'm going to list a few of these, and then we're going to compare them or contrast them to Judaism. Now, I realize Judaism was not a single entity. There were many flavors of Judaism that existed in Alexander's day. There always have been and are today. But in general, Judaism, all Jews held on to certain beliefs and certain practices in general, no matter where they lived in the world. And we're going to see that this creates the real conflict under the conflicts that broke out. And we'll talk about what those are in just a little bit. All right. The central value of Hellenism is that it is human-centered. If you lived in the Greek Empire and you went to a Greek school or you had a Greek tutor or whatever, what would be driven into you day after day after day after day in the teaching would be life is about you. That's what life's about. It's about human advancement. It's about human pleasure. It's about, human fulfillment. Humanism, that's exactly what humanism is, and that's where it starts. Now, the first humanist was actually Adam. It was Alexander, whatever. It goes all the way back from the very beginning. And so it's human-centered. What contrasts that with Judaism? Judaism would say life is not about me, it's about God. It's God-centered. The purpose of life, according to the Jew, would be to honor, glorify, and be obedient to God. And He's even given us a way to be obedient because He gave the law to Moses. It was a gift. It was not a burden. He gave Moses the law so that the people of Israel, His people, would know exactly how they can live in a way that would please Him. Those are two very different orientations toward life. And as you can see, nothing has changed. This is as old as human beings are. Okay? So, Hellenism, it was human-centered. Judaism was God-centered. Hellenism celebrated human beauty. They celebrated the beauty of the human body. Now, I don't mean to be disrespectful in any way whatsoever, but they haven't seen some of the humans that I've seen. And they probably haven't seen my body. But you think about it, when you see Greek statues, when you look at Greek art, there are very few clothes on them. That's not because they were any more sex-saturated than we are. It wasn't that. It was the human body is to be something that it's beautiful. It's to be something that is to be celebrated. And so, the human body was a good thing. And it was to be glorified. It was not to be worshipped, but it was to be on display because it was a good thing. And particularly, we'll make that into a separate one. Well, let's compare that to Judaism. Judaism does not deny the human body, but it calls for modesty. The human body is to be clothed. The human body is a gift of God, but it's not the human body that needs to be honored. It is the one who gave the gift of the human body. Again, God-centered and human-centered. Hellenism also, and it's sort of another example of number two, but Hellenism celebrated athletics. Where did the Olympics come from? From the Greeks. And when the Romans took over the Greek Empire, they continued them and added their own games to it. Athletics were a good thing. Why? Because they celebrate human achievement. They celebrate strength. They celebrate skill. Athletic skill. Those are good things. They're to be celebrated. Well, there's not much in the Old Testament that I know of about athletics one way or the other, but once again, for the Jew, even those who appreciate athletics, Jewish people who go to the games and appreciate athletics, they still live their life primarily to please God. And so they would never be as committed, they would never value athletics to the degree that the Greeks would. and probably to the degree that many people do so around us today. And so their athletics was again a way of celebrating human achievement. Okay, Hellenism was polytheistic, and they had a very different understanding of their gods. First of all, they maintained that there are gods and goddesses and spirits, and none of them controls everything. So you'll have a god who is or a spirit who controls the spring out of which you get your water. No god controls everything, and all of those gods and goddesses control different aspects of your life. Those gods or goddesses are not your friends. They're out to get you. They're angry with you. Those gods and goddesses are not present. The Greek gods lived on Mount Olympus, and every once in a while they may make a surprise appearance on earth. There's an interesting story. I was reading it today in the book of Acts, where Paul and Barnabas have gone to the city of Lystra. It was on their first missionary journey, and Paul heals this man who's been sick. Nearby is a pagan temple to one of the gods or goddesses of the Greeks, and when the people see that healing, they call Paul and Barnabas, they give them names of Greek gods. They call, I think, Barnabas Zeus, and they call Paul Hermes, which means messenger. Paul did most of the talking, I guess that's why. Well, that's a good example of how the Greeks believed about their gods. And that is, they would every once in a while make a surprise appearance. It would almost always be when a miracle took place. But most of the time, they stayed on Mount Olympus, and they were not the least bit interested in your well-being. They were your enemies. And so the whole purpose, the Greeks were unbelievably religious. But they were so busy doing it because they had to appease many different gods and goddesses. Those gods were always angry at you, and so the purpose of your religion was to keep the god or goddess off your back. The last thing you would ever want would be a personal relationship with Zeus or Hermes or any of the rest of them, because they didn't care about you. Their purpose was to punish you. So worship was to appease them because they were always angry. And fortunately, through the years, I've heard of some Christians who've become just so twisted in their thinking that they talk about their relationship with God, and it sounds almost like Greek paganism, where all they think about is where God is punishing them and God is angry with them, and God does chastise us, and God certainly becomes angry. But there's nothing in all of Greek mythology that even comes close to the statement, God loves you. No matter who you are, no matter what you've done or failed to do. That idea was totally foreign. I think it's so significant in the book of Acts when the missionaries, Paul and others, are out there and they're in the Greek world. And can you imagine the disbelief when they talked to one of these Greek pagans and they said, God loves you. He wants to have a personal relationship with you. He wants you to be a part of his family. That was news to them. That was totally news to them. No wonder they misunderstood and had a hard time accepting that. It's almost like the child that grows up in a dysfunctional family and they become adults, and it's very hard for them to really believe that God actually loves them because nobody else has in their lives. And so you had these multiple gods and goddesses and spirits, and they were not friends. The purpose of pagan religion was to keep them off your back, so that they would not send bad luck your way. Well, obviously, in Judaism, there's one God. And he controls all things. He's not just the God of Israel. He's the God of the nations of the world. He's not just working among the people of Israel. He's working among the nations of the world. And he is the God of all gods. You can't compromise these two. You're either, it's sort of like being dead or alive. Nobody's half dead. You're either dead or you're alive. And these two conflict in the most profound ways you can imagine. And so this is enough. There's several other characteristics you could add, and they all pretty much come out of number one. When your focus on life is that life's about me, all the other things will follow. That's the central one. So, what Alexander wants to happen with making Greek the universal language. And of course, there were more people than just Jewish people in his kingdom, in his empire. But the intertestamental period deals primarily with what happened to the Jews. He wants them, they don't have to adopt these values lock, stock, and barrel. They don't have to become good Greeks. But he wants them to be sympathetic to them, and who knows? They may even like living by some of these values. That's what he hopes to accomplish. Now, how effective was the spread of Greek? And this is something we're going to talk about next week, and it's not directly on this, but just to go ahead. One of the most significant works that came out of the intertestamental period was the Septuagint. We'll talk about it next week. The Septuagint began to appear. It didn't come out all at one time, but the Septuagint, first part of it was probably the first 5 books of the Old Testament. It came out in Egypt, where it was produced, and it came out in about 250 BC. Now that is, I haven't put Alexander's death yet, but that's 75 years after Alexander dies. The Septuagint is a Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament. And it came out over a long period of time. This was sort of the first installment of it. Now think about it. What is this? And it came out in Egypt. What's the significance of that? Well, the only reason that you would translate the Hebrew Old Testament into Greek, there's only one. A lot of Jews can no longer read their Bibles. They go to the synagogue and they cannot understand what's being said, because their Bible is written in Hebrew, and the synagogue service would be carried out in Hebrew. That tells us that in 75 years after Alexander's death, there were Jews, and one of the biggest communities of Jews that existed in the ancient world was in Egypt. It goes all the way back to Old Testament times. You may remember when Jeremiah, of course, he witnessed the destruction of Jerusalem, but this was in 587, and the Babylonians counted him to be a friend, and they let him either go into exile or let him stay. He stayed in Judah for a while, and then he went to this community of Jews in Egypt. It had been there for centuries. What that tells us is that in Egypt there was a whole generation of Jews who had become so influenced by Greek. That's the language that they spoke, and they could no longer read their Bible. They could no longer understand the synagogue service. That happened in 75 years. That's quick. And we'll talk about how Jews responded to the Septuagint next week when we talk about it. All right, so Alexander is he wants Greek language to produce these values in the lives of any who will accept it. And of course, we're primarily concerned about the Jews. Okay. Well, funny thing happens, not a funny thing, but probably an unexpected thing. Alexander dies in 323. The ripe old age of 32 years of age. He, like many people that are driven and are capable of just doing remarkable things in their lives, and he surely did that. But those achievers, those type 1 personalities often, not always, but often fall into periods of deep depression and despair. Alexander, according, and there are multiple stories about this, it's not altogether clear, but in a battle that he was fighting, and as I said, he fought beside his men. He didn't fight behind the lines. He was out there with them. And one of his best friends, who was a soldier, was killed. Alexander went into a deep, deep, dark period of depression and despair. And foolishly enough, he believed that the cure for it was that you fill your body with alcohol. He was a big drinker. He went on a 4-day drinking binge, and he never waked up from it. He died, 32 years old. He was never married. Of course, he had no children. So what is now going to happen to his empire? Well, it was divided between his generals. He had 5. They divided it into 5 pieces, and there is only 2 of these generals that we're really concerned about. There was a general named Ptolemy, and there was a general named Seleucus. Ptolemy got Egypt, and Seleucus got Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Notice, Palestine is right in the middle of it. It's a bridge, land bridge between 2 continents. So Ptolemy is in Egypt. The Jewish people live in Palestine, and Seleucus is up here. Sometimes First Maccabees will refer to it as Syria. There are different names used, but basically talking about the land of Mesopotamia. And so, Alexander dies, Ptolemy gets Egypt, Seleucus gets Mesopotamia and part of this region up here, and both of them wanted Palestine. Now why? This becomes very important for understanding the entire Old Testament. This piece of land, and of course the borders vary from time to time, but this piece of land is not a rich piece of land to hang on to hold in the biblical world. It has very, very few natural resources. Much of it does not have water, so there's not a whole lot of good cropland. Much of it is mountainous. Why has this been the most fought over piece of real estate on earth? And it is. It has been. Well, look at the map. The only way that down here, this is the northern part of the continent of Africa. That's a pretty big piece of the earth. And up here, if you extended it, it's the continent of Asia. Another big piece of the earth. Whoever, if you're in the trade business, the trade always moved from north to south. And all the trade routes had to go through Palestine. Palestine, and of course the borders change from time to time, but in the days of Jesus, from the southern to the northern border of Palestine is 140 miles. Palestine is narrower at the top than it is at the bottom, so at the top it is 40 miles wide. At the bottom it is 70 miles wide. You can take all of the Palestine in Jesus' day and put it in the state of Vermont and still have some of Vermont left over. We're not talking about an empire. Why was it so important? Whoever controlled the trade routes, and all 4 of them went through Palestine. This is how people up here would ship goods to Egypt, and this is how people in Egypt would ship goods to other places. All 4 of them had to go through Palestine. You can't trade through the Arabian Desert. And so whoever controls this narrow piece of land essentially controls 2 continents. So everybody wanted it. But here's the problem. It's hard to hang on to. Because regardless of which empire we're talking about, if we're talking about Egypt, Palestine is going to be an appendix. It's going to be hard to hang on to an appendix. It's not in the center of Egypt, it's an extension. Or if Seleucus wants it up here from Mesopotamia, it's an appendix. It's hard to defend an appendix. If your army is over here, you can't send them across the desert. You've got to send them up here and then down. If your army is in Egypt and you want to defend Palestine, then you've got to cross the Sinai Peninsula. That's not a pleasant place to be. It's hot and dry. And then you go into it. And so there's now a battle between who will control Palestine. Ptolemy in the south or Seleucus in the north. Both of them wanted it essentially because it served as a barrier from the other one. So when Seleucus controlled it, then he realized it was going to be harder for Egypt to attack his part of the empire because they've got to go through not only the Sinai Peninsula, but they've got to go through Palestine. And then vice versa is also true. When Seleucus has it, when Egypt has it, then they've got a barrier there before Seleucus' troops would come into Egypt. Well, here's what happens. Alexander dies in 323. Ptolemy controls it until about 200. So for roughly 125 years, Ptolemy controls Palestine. And this was a peaceful time in Palestine. And the reason is, and the rulers who will come from Ptolemy will all be Ptolemy I, Ptolemy II, Ptolemy. Ptolemy was actually a title. I mean, his name is probably, Joe Brown. But he's Ptolemy I, Ptolemy II, and so forth. And the Seleucids did the same thing. But from about 323 to about 200 BC, the Jews at Palestine were at peace. They liked the Ptolemies. Because the Ptolemies, as long as they obeyed, the basic laws, the Ptolemies did not try to push Hellenism on them. They left the Jews alone. And so the Jews loved the Ptolemies. The Jews could practice their faith. They could go to the temple. They could go to the synagogue. They could read the Torah. They could do all of these things, and they were left alone by the Ptolemies. The Ptolemies had no problem with letting the Jews practice their religion. They couldn't revolt, and they could, they had to pay their taxes, and they had to obey the laws, but the Jews didn't mind doing that because the Ptolemies left them alone. Well, that changes in about 200 BC. In 200 BC, and the Ptolemies were able to control Palestine because Seleucus and those who followed him were in a state of weakness. So they just didn't have the wherewithal to invade Palestine and hang on to it. Well, that reversed in 200 or thereabouts. These dates are not exact, but in 200, Egypt had fallen into a state of weakness. And Seleucus, or the Seleucids, their descendants, the people who follow them will be the Ptolemies, the rulers that came, and then there are the Seleucids. these are the guys, the people that ruled after Ptolemy and Seleucus had died. And so the next, 100 years or actually more than that, they're going to be ruled either by the Seleucids or by the Ptolemies. They love being ruled by the Ptolemies because the Ptolemies left them alone. Did not try to force them to adopt Greek culture or Greek religion. They let them practice their own religion, and they were left alone, and the Jews were happy. Well, what happened around 200 was the Ptolemies began to get weaker, the Seleucids began to get stronger, and the Seleucids took the land of Palestine from the Ptolemies. These two nations, or these two parts of the empire, would fight each other for 200 years. And, at one point the Ptolemies would be stronger, at the other point the Seleucids. But it was a seesaw battle for 200 years or so. And so in 200 BC, things change. The Ptolemies are weak. The Seleucids now control Palestine. And they're not like the Ptolemies. The Seleucids want the Jewish people to become good Greek people. The Seleucids began to enforce Hellenism. And, of course, there's great resistance from the Jewish people. Well, a wise ruler, when he's trying to enforce something on people and is getting pretty stiff resistance, probably needs to back off. Some of the world's dictators and tyrants and some, people in the contemporary world, they've never learned that lesson. Well, the Seleucids never did learn it. And so they began to pressure the Jews in Palestine to adopt Greek ways, to become more Greek in their dress, more Greek in their values, and that sort of thing. And there is resistance from some of the Jews. Here's the problem. The Jews are divided. By this time, some of them have grown to like the Hellenistic lifestyle. They're still Jews, they still go to the temple, they still go to the synagogue, but they sort of like it. They like to go to the games. They like to go and participate in Greek ways. The central institution for the Greek, the thing that sort of brought it all together was the gymnasium. Now, a gymnasium for them was more than it is for us. It's just a place where we go and work out or whatever. But a gymnasium even had religious ties to it. What's interesting is where the word gymnasium comes from. It comes from a Greek word. And that Greek word is gymnos, which means naked. That's why we call them family life centers now. Greek athletes, because they think the human body is a good thing, and these would be mainly males. When they would go to the gymnasium to work out, they stripped their clothes off. Well, the other thing that the Greeks were fond of was an alternative lifestyle. So homosexuality was not just an alternative way to live. For many Greeks, it was the preferred way to live. And so the gymnasium became, it's sort of like I grew up in my family and godly family as best we could be, but I grew up thinking that the closest place to hell on earth was a pool hall. And for my mother and father, I don't know why they had that. And believe me, I never went into one until I was in the 12th grade. And I went into it with a partner, and we were selling ads for the annual. I was on the annual staff. And folks, I remember till this day, and that was a long time ago. when I walked in that, it was in broad daylight and nobody was in there much. I was expecting the walls to fall down. Well, that's the way the gymnasium was to the Jew. This is the pit to hell. And so, but this was the gymnasium in Greek life. In many ways, it captured what Hellenism is about. It's human-centered. It celebrates the beauty of the human body. It certainly, there are no restrictions on sexual behavior or whatever. It goes, when you throw God at it, you don't have to worry about that. And so the gymnasium was just, it was offensive. Well, at one time, we'll have to come back and finish this up next time. But the period of time from 200 BC literally until we get to the year 63 BC, about 140 years, the Jewish people in Palestine will be dominated by the Hellenistic Jews, the Jews that believe that the Greek lifestyle is not all that bad, and so they compromise with it. Some of them grossly compromise, some just in moderate ways. First Maccabees tells us about young Greek men who exercised in the nude, in the gymnasium, and because they bore the marks of circumcision, some of them went to the trouble of having those marks surgically removed. Now, don't ask me how. Looks like to me when you take something off, you're not going to be able to put it back on. But that's how much they wanted to adopt Hellenism. Now there were other Jewish males and other Jews, and they accepted certain parts. So they were not all the same. Some Jews would value some things about Hellenism, but some would go to the extreme that we've just said. And what happens from 200 to 63 BC? They're in a seesaw battle. For 30 or 40 or 50 years, the king, the leader of the Jewish people, will be someone who was like Ptolemy. He's not interested in imposing the Greek ways upon the Jewish people. And of course, during that time, you basically got two groups of Jews, and this is really the battle of the intertestamental period. You have one group called the Hellenists, and that's what they're called in First Maccabees. The Hellenists were the Jews who were pro-Greek. They were not pro-Greek to the same degree. Some of them would do what these young men did when they were exercising in the gymnasium. They wanted to conform to Greek culture so much they didn't want to appear differently. And others would only mildly compromise. So the compromise was not to the same degree. But Hellenists were those Jews who found Greek culture, at least some things about Greek culture, to be good. They accepted it. And were still good practicing Jews. Well, their counterpart were the Hasidim. The word Hasid in Hebrew means pure. These were the Jews who believed that we've got to reject anything Greek and be faithful to God. Now, once again, there were differing degrees of that rejection. There were some that were like my parents who would say that the gymnasium, you can't even walk by one without getting polluted by it. You can't have anything to do with it. And there were others who could say, well, no, some things in the Greek world are not. A good practicing, godly Jew can do those things, can participate in them. The Jewish people were divided, but they were divided into they had extreme wings of both of those groups of people. That's the real conflict of the intertestamental period. It's not a conflict primarily between the Jewish people and their overlords, the Ptolemies or the Seleucids. That's partly true, but that's not really where the battle is. The real battle is which side will control Judaism. Will the Hellenists control or will the Hasidim control? And these sides, they're very much like the inability that some segments of our society today where we can't even talk to each other about things. You know, we both want to kill each other, and so we can't even talk about that. That's exactly what that is the conflict of the intertestamental period. The Hellenists maintain if Judaism doesn't change, it's going to become extinct. And the Hasidim would argue if Judaism is not faithful to God, they're going to become extinct. You have those two sort of impossible positions, and then you have, of course, many Jewish people in the middle. Well, it was not just a battle of words; it was a battle that was carried out on the battlefield itself. But we'll get to that part next week. Our time is getting real close right now. Are there questions that you want to raise before we stop?
This was still a dynamic in the early Christendom. Paul, the apostle,
Exactly.
there's still remnants, or there's still the continuation of that.
Yeah, and you know
the tension between Hellenism and
exactly. And another sort of flavor of it, though it's a little bit different, different reasons for it. But the biggest conflict, as I see in the early church, was actually the issue: do Gentiles have to become Jews before they become Christians? I mean, that is the battle of the New Testament. And that's a little bit different, but similar to this as well. Can God accept you like you are, or have you got to become something else? You know, you've got to join another group.
What's going on with those Jews that are in Egypt during this time? Are they just hanging out, or do they move back into Palestine? Or
We don't know. We're talking about a large number of people. My hunch is that they did. Some of them aligned themselves with the Hasidim. Some aligned themselves more with the Hellenists, and I suspect a great number of them were like I am, and probably many of you as well. I don't really align myself with anybody very much, because it appears that almost every position is an extreme position. And you know, when life can be reduced to the simplicity of 1 + 1 = 2, I wish it was that simple. But the older I get, the more unknowns there are in life, and the less I understand. That doesn't scare me. It actually excites me. I think sometimes not being able to understand our world, it helps us to try to probe it, try to understand people. It's not a weakness, it may be a strength. I think that's where the majority of it. I think it's where the majority has pretty much always been. And of course, you can imagine there were all kinds of other dynamics going on. There were political ambitions that showed up in this, where people wanted to be the king of Israel for a while, or wanted to be the high priest. We'll talk about some specifics of that next week. So all this was big. There were all kinds of mixed motives in this, like there always is. But this is the conflict of the intertestamental period, and we're going to see some specific ways. There was a 3-year revolt called the Maccabean Revolt. It resulted, we'll talk about that a little bit. Prior to that, we'll talk about this wild king of the Seleucids called Antiochus Epiphanes IV. He was, many of the Jews in his day believed that he was the Antichrist. He was diabolical toward the Jewish people. Among other things, he takes a pig and sacrifices it inside the temple in the Holy of Holies. You can imagine, and that's actually what started the Maccabean Revolt. He outlawed the practice of Judaism. Arrested Jews who were caught with a copy of the Torah, and took copies of the Torah, the first 5 books, out, put them in the streets of Jerusalem, and ordered his soldiers to burn them.
Officer of the male dominated period. What's wrong with women in this period?
You want to get me in trouble. It was the Jewish, I think that the negative way that Jewish men treated their wives has been over-argued tremendously in the literature. And that is, but it certainly was not the kind of equality that we have today and expect today. But women were solid. It was, and it wasn't just with Jews; it was all over the world. It was the Greek world was a male-dominated world. It wasn't just Jews. it was a man's world, and women were considered to be pieces of property that weren't necessarily treated like pieces of property. But they were pieces of property, and the man controlled. And that was true of Jews and non-Jews as well. But we'll come back next week at the very beginning, and we'll come back to some of these concrete manifestations like the Maccabean revolt, and we'll see where this finally ends. So, thank you all very much.